The White House is pushing back against bipartisan criticism of a potential emerging deal to end that conflict. Regional officials are telling the Associated Press that under the proposal, the war would end and Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz, as well as give up its stockpile of the highly enriched uranium, with the details and timelines to be worked out later during a 60-day window. Iran has not publicly committed to giving up its uranium, but the country's president told state TV that they were ready to, quote, assure the world that we are not after a nuclear weapon. Several Republicans took to social media over the weekend to speak out against the framework agreement. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas said that if the proposal allows Iran to continue to enrich uranium and to potentially build a nuclear weapon and effectively retain control over the Strait of Hormuz, then, in his words, that outcome would be a disastrous mistake. Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi echoed that sentiment, writing that the rumored 60-day ceasefire would be a disaster. Trump's former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, denounced the proposal as not remotely America first. Now, President Trump is working to fight off that skepticism, saying on social media that he instructed his negotiators to not rush into a deal, and insisting that what is being worked on is the, quote, exact opposite of a nuclear pact that was agreed to under the Obama administration. The president added the deal isn't even fully negotiated yet, so don't listen to those losers who are critical about something they know nothing about. Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued this defense yesterday.
Multiple political leaders, multiple presidents of the United States have all said the same thing. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. The only one who's tried to do anything and has actually done anything about it in a real way has been President Trump. So his commitment to that principle that they'll never have a nuclear weapon shouldn't be questioned by anybody. And the idea that somehow this president, given everything he's already proven he's willing to do, is going to somehow agree to a deal that ultimately winds up putting Iran in a stronger position when it comes to nuclear ambitions is absurd. That's just not going to happen.
So, Richard Haass, let's go through this. Over the weekend, a flurry of reports that the deal was on first of all, there were rumors at the end of last week that the president was about to resume hostilities. Instead, it seems like the pushing negotiations, a deal on the doorstep. The brakes were tapped a little bit yesterday. I was told by senior officials this is still at least a few days away. It's not quite done yet. But let's talk about what we do know. And there's some mixed signals. There are two main areas, the uranium, the future of the nuclear deal, and the Strait of Hormuz. Why don't we go through what you know of what's on the table and whether this would be a good deal for the United States?
Two separate questions. The pieces are all there. You're right, though. It hasn't quite come together, some of the important details. It's Strait first. Let's start with the Strait, because in a funny sort of way, the nuclear has been slightly pushed, not aside, but it's on a second, slower track. The idea is to get a ceasefire in place, get the Strait opened. Still uncertain, Jonathan, of the long-term terms under which the Strait would operate, but at least for the first 30 days, supposedly, the Iranians would demine, there wouldn't be tolls or fees charged. So that, in some ways, is at least temporary return to the status quo ante, what existed on February 27th. And that's a long process of unwinding all these ships that are in the Strait. But it's a step in the right direction. You'll see energy prices begin to come down and so forth. Nuclear is in some ways more complicated. And there you've got the question of what's the status of the enriched uranium that's in Iran? Is it moved out? If so, to where? If it stays, is it diluted? Who oversees the process? So that's one question. Question about future enrichment. Is Iran allowed to enrich? If so, how much? To what level? Is there a moratorium before it's allowed to start enriching again? If so, is it 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? Some of these details. I've heard nothing about the details of an inspection regime. How, who is going to operate that? What kind of access are they going to have? Because in some ways, whatever the details, you can only have confidence in Iranian compliance if you have a really powerful, intrusive inspection regime. And maybe I've missed it. I haven't heard a lot of that. Then in all of this, there's the question of sequencing. Iran does this in the Strait. You begin to talk about the nuclear. Well, what are the incentives for Iran? Other than the United States would lift its blockade, because right now, essentially, you have twin blockades. There's the question of two things. sanctions relief for Iran, and frozen asset return. And the question is, how much do we upfront that to encourage them to act on the Strait? To what extent do we keep some of that on the back burner to encourage them to do what we want on the nuclear? So that's where we are. What's interesting is also what's not here. But listen, think about what we haven't mentioned. Haven't mentioned Iranian ballistic missiles, which for the Israelis was the most important issue before this war started 3 months ago. Second of all, we haven't mentioned drones. Thirdly, we haven't talked about Iranian support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. So the Israeli agenda is not really being addressed, and what's being, with the exception of the nuclear issue. And so, but the two issues being addressed are Strait and nuclear, and then there's the question again of all the Iranian assets. Is this a good agreement? I think the problem for the president and for the Israeli prime minister is going to say we are better off. And I, quite honestly, I do not see how they could say how we are better off.
All right, Richard, we'll revisit the Israel piece of this in a minute. But David Rohde, let's go to you now. Let's talk about the Iran's incentives, right? Richard brought that up. With the blockade is still in place. That is taking some economic toll. We know, there's unclear exactly how long Iran will be able to withstand that. Some people think it could be a matter of weeks. Some could be months. And President Trump did say the blockade would remain in place during this negotiation period. So it's still there. It's still there now. So why would Iran, from what officials you're talking to, why do they think now is the right moment? And speak up to what we know about how they view the future of the Strait of Hormuz, because there's been a lot of mixed signals, even in recent days, some suggestion that they were, in fact, going to insist upon some sort of tolling or fee structure for this vital waterway.
So it's interesting. Just overnight, a couple colleagues of ours spoke with an Iranian official who doesn't want to be named, but they've sent a message. It was Ian Sherwood, our London producer, and Rich Greenberg, who works on the national security team. And it's this Iranian official is very clear in terms of this memorandum of understanding, and they just call it a memorandum of understanding. This is not a broad peace agreement, but there is no detailed decision on nuclear. They don't want to talk about nuclear. No, there's only a general agreement to talk on nuclear issues as a follow-up to this memorandum of understanding. So they're pushing back hard on this key issue for President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu about the nuclear, the enriched uranium and the nuclear program that Richard was just talking about. So that seems to be a firm Iranian position. And then, for the time being, we must concentrate on the most immediate matter, which is ending the war. That, I assume, means they want this blockade of their ports lifted. And then there's also this, they talk about this American, they call it an addiction to sanctions. So clearly the Iranians are looking for some sanctions relief as part of this deal. But they're saying that is slowing this down because the U.S. won't, I think, give them more immediate sanctions relief. So it's interesting to me because if you saw the process yesterday, and Richard talked about this very hard sort of pushback from some Republicans about the dangers of Iran's nuclear program, the president has turned in, said the key rationale for this entire war is preventing Iran from ever having a nuclear weapon. And the Iranians are saying, we are not going to negotiate about that at all in this 60-day agreement. So that's, I think, going to be a challenge in the days ahead to get a detailed agreement.
Yeah, that is going to be a very tough thing for the president to sell, that this war, frankly, put us, the world, in a better, safer place than before. And Ali Vitali, it does seem like those concerns are voiced from an unlikely place. Republicans in the Senate who, yes, once in a while defy President Trump. We saw a little bit last week on some domestic matters, but it was striking how vociferous some on the right were over the weekend as details of this deal began to emerge in the press, in the Senate, and also other conservative media spheres. Take us to Capitol Hill. What's the reasoning? What are they hoping for, a pressure campaign that might get Trump to hold off?
Well, they're going to have to defend this on the campaign trail, some of them anyway. I mean, Tom Tillis has been among the more vocal Republicans pushing back against this on the Sunday shows. He has said that he's unbridled by the fact that he's not seeking re-election, and so he can use different, more blunt words to describe a criticism that he says he would have regardless. But I do think that this is an interesting point where Republicans are trying to look for, okay, what are we going to tell voters we got for them having to pay higher prices at the pump, for an administration that seems distracted from dealing with affordability concerns. And what they're looking at now is not being able to say that Iran is further from a nuclear weapon. And I think what's interesting to me is I was watching Republican senators even a month ago try to start saying that the win out of this war is going to be the Strait of Hormuz reopening, which was closed because of the conflict in the first place. And then, of course, the idea that Iran is more destabilized and has less from a missile stockpile perspective than before. The idea of what is obliterated is going to be really important. And Republicans were already starting to negotiate with what success looked like for this conflict. Now that the administration is saying, OK, we might have a memorandum of understanding that doesn't directly or immediately deal with the nuclear question, that doesn't deal with proxy groups, all of that makes it harder for Republicans to say, OK, we actually have something to sell as a victory. And that is why they're starting to voice this early concern. I think it's notable when you look at someone like Senator Roger Wicker saying that this would be a disaster. It's important, given the fact that he is a chairman of an important committee, that he is someone who has been at least skeptical of what some of the administration has briefed Congress on. We're starting to hear concerns even, too, around Pete Hegseth. What is the intelligence that the Hill is being given? So there are just more questions starting to be asked. I will also say it feels notable to me that Tillis is signaling that he wants any of these deals to go through and be ratified by Congress. But it feels flimsy to ask for that, given the ways that this administration has bypassed Congress at every turn of this Iran conflict. And now Republicans are basically going to be left holding the bag, defending it on the campaign trail, but maybe not having much to defend.